Hello and welcome to this episode of the GrowVC Everyone Funding Startups podcast. I'm your host Marcus, and today we're here with Martin Zwilling, who's played many roles in the startup scene for several years and definitely knows the ins and outs of startups. So first of all, thank you, Martin, for being on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for having me, and I always enjoy the opportunity to share some information on startups and always learn a few things at the same time.
So, why don't we start off with you? Could you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and on your background to our audience?
Okay, well, I have had the privilege of working for both large companies and startups, small companies. First of all, a pretty good-sized career with IBM and large-scale computers. And then I left IBM, went to Silicon Valley on the west coast of the U.S. to work with small companies, work with startups. I was intrigued after my experience in IBM with the IBM PC development, with the whole concept of starting new companies. So I was able there to work with quite a few companies in both consulting and in roles, technical roles like VP of software development and executive roles. And then more recently, about 5 years ago, moved to the Phoenix, Arizona area. Let's say I'm in a give back mode where I started by doing some mentoring to local universities, ASU, others, and then started my own little company called Startup Professionals, where I more as a consultant and in many cases free to give guidance to startups. So I've, in that environment, started doing some writing. I have a blog that runs every day for startups, and I've gotten to the point where I now write for Forbes, Huffington Post, Harvard Business Review. So I have a pretty good exposure on social networks as well, Twitter, about 350,000 followers. So I get a lot of input, and I think I'm able to help some people.
Yeah, and we definitely also enjoyed your writing, so you definitely do have a good content and a good reach. You've also been working with startups for such a long time, so I thought I'd get the time perspective from you. How do you think entrepreneurship and startups have evolved during the time that you've been active with the startups?
Well, there are several ways. I think for certain, the cost of entry into entrepreneurship has gone down. I can remember back in the 80s and 90s when it would cost $1 million to create an e-commerce website. Now you can do those almost free, and certainly for a couple $1,000 you can get an e-commerce business up and running. So that's a big difference. Secondly, maybe on the other side, it's probably harder to get funding these days than it was back in those days. And the reason is that, first of all, I think the economy is down, and so there are fewer angels, fewer VCs that are liquid or willing to give money, and on the other side, there are more entrepreneurs who are looking. So it's a more competitive kind of environment. And finally, over time, we really have more opportunities for startups. There's technology continues to go, as I mentioned before, the economy continues to struggle, and sometimes that's a great time for startups.
Okay, if we just focus on the last couple of years, you talked about the economy, and it's definitely been mixed reviews with that lately. But if you think about an entrepreneur founding a startup today versus for example, 5 years ago, what do you think are the biggest differences in behavior, or should be the biggest differences in behavior?
Well, I think it's a startup or an entrepreneur or startup founder needs to do his homework maybe a little better. There seems to still be that urban myth around that I can scratch my plan on the back of a napkin and somebody's going to throw money at me. I honestly believe that never happened, or it was never a real alternative, but it certainly isn't one now. And so now I think it's very important to do a business plan. It's very important to do the networking as early as possible so that you get to know the business community, the investor community, startup community. And it's very important to take advantage of all the assistance organizations that are out there, like your platform, the incubators, all of the kinds of resources that are now out there.
So we've talked about this in the beginning. You write quite a lot. in terms of startups, and you coach and mentor lots of different companies. What are some of the most common topics that you touch on when talking with or about startups?
Well, I think one of the most common ones is the social networks, the value of social networks, value of blogging. I learned myself this in starting my own company, and I preach it to every startup. It really wasn't even an option 10 years ago, but it's now a requirement that in order to have a presence or to be visible amongst the millions of other sites, the other startups that are out there, you need to do a blog. You need to be visible on the key social networks, meaning LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and maybe others. And you need to put yourself out there. You need to show people that you're a real person. You need to show people what you know, what expertise you have, how you can contribute. And that's going to make you a lot more attractive to investors. It's going to make you a lot more attractive to customers, vendors, all the people that you need to appeal to in today's environment. So that's one area. I think another area that always gets a lot of discussion is what business model should I use or am I going to use? And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. For example, everybody seems to come to me and say, I'm going to use the Facebook model. That means I'm going to do everything free. All the services online are going to be free, and I'm going to make my money off the advertising. They don't seem to realize that that's possible. Obviously, it's happening with Facebook, Twitter, and a few others, but it takes a huge investment to get going because you have a large critical mass followers. So Facebook took 3 or 4 years and $50 million to get to the point where they were making money off that business model. And so if a startup comes to me and says, I'm going to use that model, I ask them where they're going to get the $50 million. And in fact, they typically hadn't thought about that, or they think they're going to use word of mouth or viral marketing without realizing that that's not realistic. So that business model, the freemium model, all the normal business models, certainly it's a topic for discussion. And in fact, one of the things I often find is that startup entrepreneurs haven't really thought about what their business model is. In other words, how do you make money? And if you don't make money, you're not going to survive, and certainly you're not going to find investors.
All right, talking about social networks, how many Twitter followers did you say you had?
Well, I'm a big follower of Twitter, and I now have about 365,000 followers, and I think that's a good thing. I get lots of feedback, but it's not something that happens. There's no magic, and so everybody says, "Well, how did you get that many? How did all those people find you?" And I think the simple answer to that is, I found them. In other words, I go out every day, even still, and I look for people who have entrepreneur in their profile or startup or business and in some fashion, and I follow them first. In other words, I do a proactive effort to send out a message that says, by the way, I've just written a new blog and you might take a look at it. What I find is if you offer something of value, half the people at least that you might go after will follow you. And so over time, you can build up a large following.
I still think that it's one of these things that people don't realize, or they don't realize the power of something like that. But think about 360,000 people. Imagine if you got to talk to that sort of an audience on a weekly basis. The importance of something like that, that's just crazy.
Well, it's a tremendous thing. I don't try to minimize it. I think that I'm very pleased and very honored that many people are following. But I think we all have to be realistic. The reality of Twitter is that users on Twitter are not sticky. That means that they don't tend to stay on Twitter for a long period of time. The net result is I don't have 360,000 followers, but because many of those have quit using Twitter and they just don't delete their account, and I don't know that. But from an overall marketing standpoint, you can't beat that reach. And it's sort of like advertisers who say how many views do I have on television. They count how many people are switched to that channel or seem to be on that channel, but they can't really measure how many people are watching. They don't know how many people go have a cup of coffee during the commercial, that kind of thing. So I don't, I don't want to minimize it, but I don't want to overstate what it means as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We talked